In the year 1345, as the sun struggled to pierce the morning mist over the Welsh borderlands, our silver-armored good knight found himself at the precipice of a conflict that would echo through the ages. The English knights, led by the good knight, rode into the heart of Blackwood Glen, unaware that they were walking into a meticulously laid trap set by the fierce Welsh rebels. This was not merely a skirmish. It was a clash of wills, a battle for survival in a land steeped in ancient grievances and the blood of countless generations. As the tension in the air thickened, the good knight sensed the weight of history pressing down upon him, a reminder that every choice made on this day would ripple through time. Witness the valor and tragedy of a fight where honor and duty collide, where the fate of men hangs in the balance, and where our immortal knight must navigate the treacherous waters of loyalty and survival. Join us as we delve into the depths of Blackwood Glen, where the echoes of battle will soon resound, and the good knight's journey through history continues. Subscribe to the Good Knight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to the heart of epic battles, where every clash of steel shapes the world we know today. Comment below which pivotal moment in history you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and prepare to journey back to that fateful day in 1345 when the clash of swords would determine the fate of many. The Good Knight Stories, The Skirmish at Blackwood Glen, Chapter 1, The Silver Knight's Path. The morning mist clung to the Welsh borderlands like the breath of ancient spirits, reluctant to surrender the secrets hidden within its grey embrace. Through this ethereal veil, a lone figure moved with the measured cadence of one who had walked countless battlefields across the centuries. The good knight sat astride his destrier, his silver armor catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky, each plate polished to a mirror's gleam despite the long miles behind him. The year was 1345, and the world around him bore the weight of endless conflict. King Edward III's attention was fixed upon the distant shores of France, where the 100 Years' War demanded England's finest knights and her greatest treasures. Yet here, in these forgotten valleys where England met Wales, older struggles persisted. Struggles that predated the grand campaigns across the Channel, rooted in soil that had drunk the blood of countless generations. The good knight's horse stepped carefully along the narrow track that wound through the rolling hills of the Welsh marches. Each hoofbeat seemed to echo with the memory of other journeys, other battles, other moments when the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance of a single day's fighting. But today felt different. There was something in the air, a tension that spoke of violence yet to come, of choices that would echo through the mists of time. Behind him rode a column of English knights, their armor gleaming dully in the morning light. These were not the flower of English chivalry. Those men were across the sea, winning glory in the fields of France. These were the garrison knights, the men who held the borderlands, who enforced the king's will in places where that will was neither welcomed nor easily imposed. They were good men, seasoned fighters who understood that their war was not one of grand gestures and glorious charges, but of patient vigilance and sudden, brutal action. The good knight had seen their like before, in other times, other places. Men who served not for glory but for duty, who held the line not because poets would sing of them, but because someone had to stand watch while others slept. There was honor in such service, though it was an honor that few would ever recognize or remember. As they rode deeper into the Welsh countryside, the landscape began to change. The open fields and gentle hills gave way to something wilder, more ancient. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that filtered the already dim light into something approaching twilight. This was the edge of Blackwood Glen, a place that existed on the maps of English administrators, but remained, in truth, beyond their true control. The good knight felt the familiar weight of anticipation settling upon his shoulders like a well-worn cloak. He had learned, across the long years of his existence, to read the subtle signs that preceded violence. The way birds fell silent, the manner in which horses' ears pricked forward, sensing dangers their riders had not yet perceived. The almost imperceptible shift in the air itself, as if the very atmosphere held its breath before the storm. His thoughts turned to the mission that had brought them here. Reports had reached the English garrison of Welsh rebels gathering in the deep woods, men who refused to accept the reality of English rule, who struck at tax collectors and royal messengers before melting back into the forest like morning mist. Such resistance was nothing new. It had been the pattern for decades, a slow burning ember of defiance that could never quite be extinguished, no matter how many expeditions were sent to stamp it out. The local English commanders had grown weary of these pinprick attacks, these shadows that struck and vanished, leaving only empty villages and cold trails behind. They wanted a decisive action, something that would demonstrate the futility of resistance and restore the proper order of things. And so they had assembled this force, not large enough to be called an army, but substantial enough to make their point clear to any who might be watching from the depths of the forest. The good knight understood the logic of such expeditions, even as he recognized their limitations. He had seen similar campaigns in other lands, other times. The Romans had faced the same challenge in these very hills centuries before. The Normans had struggled with it after their conquest. It was the eternal problem of empire. How to hold what you have taken, how to make your authority real in places where it was neither wanted nor easily enforced. But understanding the logic did not make the task any easier. The Welsh who opposed them were not foreign invaders or distant enemies. They were men fighting for their own soil, their own way of life. They knew every path through these woods, every stream and hollow where a man might hide or make his stand. They had grown up hearing stories of English oppression, had seen their fathers and grandfathers bend the knee to foreign lords. Their resistance was not merely political. It was personal, visceral, rooted in the very bones of the land itself. As the column moved deeper into the glen, the good knight found himself studying the terrain with the eye of a soldier who had learned, through bitter experience, to read the language of landscape. The path they followed was ancient, worn smooth by countless generations of travelers. It wound through a natural corridor between steep, wooded slopes, following the course of a small stream that chattered and gurgled over moss-covered stones. It was, he realized with growing unease, an ideal place for an ambush. The thought came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual certainty, like the slow recognition of a face glimpsed in a crowd. Every instinct honed by centuries of warfare was now screaming warnings that his conscious mind was only beginning to process. The way the path narrowed ahead, forcing the column to stretch out in a long, vulnerable line. The dense undergrowth on either side, thick enough to conceal an army. The steep slopes that would make retreat difficult, and flanking maneuvers nearly impossible. He raised his hand, signaling a halt, and the column behind him came to a ragged stop. The sound of hoofbeats faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of a raven. In the sudden quiet, the good knight could hear his own heart beat, steady and strong beneath the steel that encased his chest. "Sir Geoffrey," he called softly to the knight riding nearest to him, a grizzled veteran whose scarred face spoke of many battles. "What think you of this place?" Sir Geoffrey rode forward, his experienced eyes scanning the terrain with the same growing unease that the good knight felt. "I like it not, my lord," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too many places for enemies to hide, too few ways for us to maneuver. If I were planning an ambush—" He did not need to finish the thought. Both men had fought in enough battles to recognize a killing ground when they saw one. The question was not whether this was a trap, but whether they had already ridden too far into it to escape. The good knight's mind raced through the possibilities. They could turn back, retreat to more open ground where their cavalry would have room to operate. But that would mean abandoning their mission, returning to their commanders with nothing to show for their efforts but the admission that they had been too cautious to press forward. In the complex calculus of medieval warfare, such a retreat might be tactically sound but politically disastrous. Alternatively, they could press on, trusting to their armor and training to see them through whatever lay ahead. The Welsh rebels, for all their skill at ambush and guerrilla warfare, were lightly armed and armored. In a direct confrontation, English knights had every advantage. But this would not be a direct confrontation. It would be a battle fought on the enemy's terms, in terrain of their choosing. As he weighed these options, the good knight became aware of a subtle change in the forest around them. The birds, which had been singing moments before, had fallen silent. Even the stream seemed to murmur more quietly, as if nature itself was holding its breath. His horse shifted restlessly beneath him, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as it scented something that human senses could not yet detect. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibility and threat. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, the good knight knew. Eyes were watching them. Welsh rebels, perhaps, studying their formation, counting their numbers, preparing for the moment when they would spring their trap. Or perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps his instincts, honed by too many battles and too many years, were seeing enemies where none existed. But he had learned, across the long centuries of his existence, to trust those instincts. They had kept him alive when younger, more impetuous knights had fallen. They had guided him through battles where victory seemed impossible and defeat appeared certain. And now they were telling him that death waited in the shadows of Blackwood Glen. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. They had come too far to turn back now, both literally and figuratively. The mission demanded that they press forward, that they demonstrate English resolve in the face of Welsh defiance. To retreat without even seeing the enemy would be to hand the rebels a victory without a battle, to confirm their belief that the forest was their sanctuary, inviolate and secure. "We continue," the good knight said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "But with caution. Sir Geoffrey, send scouts ahead. Keep the column tight, and have the men ready their weapons. If there are enemies in these woods, we shall meet them as knights should, with courage and honor." The order was passed down the line in whispers, and the column began to move again. But now there was a different quality to their advance. Where before they had ridden with the casual confidence of men on a routine patrol, now they moved with the heightened awareness of soldiers entering battle. Hands rested on sword hilts, eyes scanned the forest on either side, and every man felt the weight of his armor not as a burden, but as a lifeline. The good knight rode at the head of the column, his silver armor gleaming like a beacon in the forest gloom. He had chosen this position deliberately, knowing that if an attack came, it would likely be directed at the leaders first. Better that he should bear the brunt of it than the younger knights who followed him. He had survived countless battles, countless ambushes. If anyone could weather the storm that was coming, it would be him. But even as he steeled himself for what lay ahead, a part of his mind wandered to the broader implications of this moment. This skirmish, if it came, would be a small thing in the grand sweep of history. No chroniclers would record it, no poets would sing of it. It would be forgotten within a generation, lost among the countless other small battles that shaped the destiny of nations through their accumulated weight, rather than their individual significance. Yet for the men who fought it, it would be everything. For some, it would be their last day on earth. For others, it would be a story they would tell their grandchildren, a moment when they faced death and emerged victorious. And for the Welsh rebels waiting in the forest, it would be a chance to strike a blow for their freedom, to prove that English rule was not absolute, that resistance was still possible. The path ahead curved to the right, following the contours of the stream. As they rounded the bend, the good knight saw that the forest grew even thicker, the canopy so dense that it seemed like twilight despite the morning hour. The stream had carved a narrow valley through the landscape, with steep wooded slopes rising on either side. It was a place of natural beauty, but also of natural danger, a corridor that could become a trap with terrifying ease. His horse's hooves rang against the stones of the streambed as they forded a shallow crossing. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the forest quiet, echoing off the surrounding hills like a bell tolling the approach of fate. Behind him, he could hear the splash and clatter as the rest of the column followed, their passage marking them as clearly as if they had been carrying banners and blowing trumpets. And still the forest watched them, silent and patient as a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The deeper they rode into Blackwood Glen, the more the forest seemed to close around them like the jaws of some ancient beast. The good knight felt the familiar sensation that had accompanied him through countless campaigns, the peculiar mixture of heightened awareness and resigned acceptance that came when a warrior knew he was walking into danger, but had no choice but to continue forward. His silver armor, which had gleamed so brilliantly in the morning light, now seemed almost to absorb the forest's gloom. Each plate had been crafted by master armorers, fitted to his form with the precision that only centuries of experience could provide. The steel was of the finest quality, tempered and retempered until it could turn aside the sharpest blade or the most powerful blow. Yet for all its protection, he knew that armor was only as good as the man who wore it, and even the finest steel had its weaknesses. The weight of the armor was something he had long since ceased to notice in the ordinary course of things. 55 pounds of metal, distributed across his body with careful attention to balance and mobility. In open ground, mounted on his destrier, it made him nearly invincible, a moving fortress of steel and flesh that could smash through enemy lines like a thunderbolt hurled by an angry god. But here, in this narrow defile where the trees pressed close and the undergrowth caught at stirrups and sword hilts, that same armor began to feel less like protection and more like a burden. He thought of the Welsh rebels who were surely watching them even now from their concealed positions among the trees. They would be lightly armed and armored, carrying perhaps a leather jerkin or a shirt of mail, but nothing like the elaborate protection that encased every English knight in the column. What they lacked in armor, however, they would make up for in mobility and knowledge of the terrain. They could move through this forest like ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will, striking from unexpected angles before melting back into the green shadows. The good knight had fought such enemies before, in other times and other places. He remembered the Saracens in the Holy Land, who had used similar tactics against the Crusader armies. light cavalry and foot archers who refused to stand and fight in the manner that Christian knights understood, preferring instead to harass and weaken their enemies through 1,000 small cuts rather than seeking a single decisive blow. It was a frustrating way to fight, but undeniably effective when employed by men who understood their craft. Behind him, he could hear the quiet conversations of his men as they rode. They spoke in the low, careful tones of soldiers who knew they might be overheard by unfriendly ears, but the very fact that they were talking at all spoke to their nervousness. Experienced warriors learned to find comfort in the familiar rhythms of military life. The creak of leather, the jingle of mail, the steady clip-clop of hooves on stone. But when those rhythms were disrupted, when the normal patterns of march and rest were replaced by the heightened tension of imminent combat, even veteran soldiers felt the need to fill the silence with words. "Mark my words," he heard Sir Geoffrey saying to the knight beside him. "We'll not see home again without bloodshed. This place reeks of ambush." "Aye," came the reply from Sir William, a younger knight whose enthusiasm for battle had not yet been tempered by experience. "But let them come. Welsh rebels or no, they'll find English steel a hard thing to swallow." The good knight smiled grimly at the young man's confidence. He had been like that once, centuries ago, when the world had seemed simpler and enemies more easily defeated. Time and experience had taught him that courage, while necessary, was not always sufficient. The graveyard of history was filled with brave men who had underestimated their enemies or overestimated their own abilities. The path they followed had grown narrower still, forcing the column to stretch out in a long, vulnerable line. The good knight could see perhaps 20 yards ahead before the track curved out of sight around a massive oak tree whose trunk was easily 6 feet across. Behind him, the column extended back into the forest gloom, each knight separated from his fellows by just enough distance to prevent mutual support if an attack came suddenly. It was, he realized, exactly the formation that an enemy would want them to adopt. Strung out, unable to concentrate their force, with limited room to maneuver. If he had been planning an ambush, this was precisely the moment he would have chosen to spring it. The thought had barely formed in his mind when his horse suddenly shied, ears flattening against its skull as it caught a scent that spoke of danger. The destrier was a veteran of many battles, trained to remain calm under the most extreme circumstances, but even the best trained warhorse retained the instincts that had kept its wild ancestors alive. And those instincts were now screaming warnings that something was terribly wrong. The good knight's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, though he did not yet draw the blade. Around him, the forest had fallen into an unnatural silence that seemed to press against his ears like a physical weight. Even the stream, which had been chattering merrily over its rocky bed, seemed to flow more quietly now, as if it too sensed the approaching storm. He raised his hand again, signaling another halt, and turned in his saddle to look back at his men. What he saw in their faces confirmed his own growing certainty that they were riding into a trap. These were experienced soldiers, men who had learned to read the signs of impending battle, and every one of them showed the tight-lipped tension of warriors preparing for combat. "Sir Geoffrey," he called softly, "bring the rear guard forward. Close up the column." The order was passed back along the line, and the good knight heard the sound of horses being urged into a faster pace as the knights at the rear of the column moved to compress their formation. It was a sensible precaution, but he knew it might already be too late. If the Welsh rebels were as skilled as he suspected, they would have already positioned themselves to take advantage of the column's extended formation. Closing ranks now might prevent the situation from getting worse, but it would not undo the tactical disadvantage they had already accepted by riding into this narrow defile. As the column compressed, the good knight found himself studying the terrain with renewed intensity. The stream they had been following curved sharply to the left, just ahead, disappearing around a rocky outcropping that was crowned with a thick stand of hazel and oak. The slopes on either side of the valley rose steeply, covered with dense undergrowth that could conceal an army. It was a textbook ambush site, the kind of place that military engineers would design if they were trying to create the perfect killing ground. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft snorting of horses and the creak of leather as armored men shifted in their saddles. The good knight could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his armor, despite the cool air of the forest morning. It was not the sweat of exertion, but of anticipation, the body's response to the knowledge that violence was imminent. He thought of the Welsh longbow, that terrible weapon that had already begun to change the nature of warfare across Europe. The English had learned its power the hard way, in battles against Welsh rebels who could send arrows through mail and even plate armor at ranges that made conventional cavalry charges suicidal. The weapon was not new. The Welsh had been using it for generations, but its tactical implications were only now being fully understood. A longbow arrow, shot by a skilled archer, could penetrate the finest armor at distances of 200 yards or more. More importantly, it could kill or cripple a war horse, turning a mounted knight into a foot soldier in an instant. In open ground, where cavalry could maneuver and close quickly with their tormentors, this might not be decisive. But here, in this narrow valley where movement was restricted and escape routes limited, a few dozen skilled archers could turn a column of knights into a slaughter pen. The good knight's horse took a nervous step forward, and he realized that he had been sitting motionless for several minutes, lost in his tactical analysis. Around him, his men were growing increasingly restless, their eyes scanning the forest on either side of the path. The tension was becoming palpable, a living thing that seemed to feed on itself and grow stronger with each passing moment. "My lord," Sir Geoffrey said quietly, riding up beside him, "the men are asking what we wait for. Shall we press on, or—" The question hung in the air, unfinished but perfectly clear. They could still retreat, could turn around and ride back the way they had come. It would mean abandoning their mission, returning to their commanders with nothing accomplished, but it would also mean that they would live to fight another day. The alternative was to continue forward into what was almost certainly a trap, trusting to their armor and their skill to see them through whatever lay ahead. The good knight looked back at his men one more time, seeing in their faces the same mixture of fear and determination that he had observed in countless other soldiers in countless other battles. They were good men, brave men, who would follow him into hell itself if he asked it of them. The question was whether he had the right to ask such a thing, whether the mission they had been given was worth the lives it might cost. But even as he wrestled with the decision, he knew what the answer had to be. They were knights, sworn to serve their king and uphold his authority wherever it might be challenged. To retreat now, without even seeing the enemy, would be to abandon everything they had sworn to defend. It would be a victory for the Welsh rebels that would echo far beyond this single encounter, encouraging others to take up arms against English rule. "We continue," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "but slowly and with weapons ready. If there are enemies in these woods, we shall meet them as knights should." The column began to move again, but now there was a different quality to their advance. Where before they had ridden with the casual alertness of men on patrol, now they moved with the focused intensity of warriors entering battle. Swords were loosened in their sheaths, lances were couched and ready, and every man felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when death might be only moments away. The good knight rode at the head of the column, his silver armor catching what little light filtered through the forest canopy. He had chosen this position deliberately, knowing that if an attack came, The enemy would likely target the leaders first. It was a calculated risk, but one that his experience and equipment made him better able to survive than the younger knights who followed him. As they approached the sharp curve in the stream, the good knight felt his horse's muscles tense beneath him. The destrier could sense something that human senses could not yet detect. Perhaps the scent of men hidden in the undergrowth, perhaps the subtle sounds of weapons being readied for use. Whatever it was enough to set every nerve in the great horse's body on edge. The path curved around the rocky outcropping, and for a moment the good knight found himself looking into a natural amphitheater formed by the convergence of 3 small valleys. The stream they had been following was joined here by 2 others, creating a small pool before continuing on its way toward the distant sea. It was a place of considerable beauty, with moss-covered rocks and ferns growing in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy above. It was also, he realized with a sinking heart, the perfect place for an ambush. The slopes on all 3 sides rose steeply from the water's edge, covered with dense undergrowth that could conceal hundreds of men. The path they had been following continued around the edge of the pool, but it was narrow and treacherous, forcing them to ride in single file with no room to deploy into battle formation. If enemies were hidden in those slopes, and every instinct told him that they were, his column would be caught in a crossfire from which there would be no escape. Behind him, he heard Sir Geoffrey's sharp intake of breath as the older knight reached the same conclusion. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," the veteran whispered. "We're riding into a trap." The good knight nodded grimly, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. "Aye," he replied quietly. "But it's too late to turn back now. Pass the word. Prepare for battle." Even as the order was whispered back along the column, the good knight found himself studying the terrain with the eye of a man who might have only minutes left to live. The pool was perhaps 50 yards across, with the path they were following skirting its eastern edge. To their left, the slope rose sharply, covered with oak and hazel that would provide perfect concealment for archers. To their right, across the water, another slope rose even more steeply, its face broken by rocky outcroppings that would serve as natural fortifications. Ahead, the path continued around the northern edge of the pool before disappearing into the forest once again. If they could reach that point, they might be able to break free of the trap and find more favorable ground for fighting. But it was a long 50 yards, and every step would be taken under the eyes of enemies who had chosen this ground for their own purposes. The good knight's horse stepped delicately along the narrow path, its hooves ringing against the stones with sounds that seemed to echo from the surrounding hills like the tolling of funeral bells. Behind him, he could hear the similar sounds made by the horses of his men, a rhythmic percussion that marked their progress toward whatever fate awaited them in the depths of Blackwood Glen. The silence of the forest was now so complete that it seemed almost supernatural. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died away to nothing. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the storm would finally break and the killing would begin. And in that silence, the good knight heard something that made his blood run cold. The soft whisper of bowstrings being drawn, the sound barely audible but unmistakable to a man who had heard it countless times before. Somewhere in the undergrowth around them, Welsh archers were taking aim, their longbows bent and ready to loose death upon the English column. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the words never came. Instead, the forest exploded into violence as 100 Welsh voices raised the ancient war cry of their people, and the air filled with the deadly whisper of arrows seeking their mark. The first arrow struck the good knight's breastplate with a sound like a hammer blow against an anvil, the steel point skittering across the polished surface before spinning away harmlessly into the undergrowth. But even as he felt the impact, even as his trained mind registered that his armor had turned aside what might have been a killing shot, he knew that this single arrow was merely the herald of a storm that would test every skill he had learned across the long centuries of his existence. The Welsh war cry that had erupted from the forest around them was not the disciplined shout of soldiers advancing in formation, but something far more primal, the voice of a people fighting for their very survival, channeling generations of anger and defiance into a sound that seemed to make the very trees tremble. It was a cry that spoke of ancient grievances and fresh wounds, of fathers who had died under English swords and sons who had sworn to avenge them. And with that cry came the arrows. They fell like a deadly rain, hissing through the air with the sound of death itself. The Welsh longbow was a weapon that had been perfected over generations of warfare, crafted from the finest yew and wielded by men who had learned to draw it from childhood. In the hands of a skilled archer, it could send a bodkin point through mail and even plate armor at ranges that made conventional tactics obsolete. The good knight's destrier screamed as an arrow found the gap between its neck armor and chest protection, the steel point driving deep into the muscle beneath. The great horse reared, its hooves flailing at the air as pain and terror overwhelmed its training. For a moment, the good knight fought to control his mount, his knees gripping tight against the saddle as he tried to calm the wounded animal. But even as he struggled with his horse, his tactical mind was processing the disaster that was unfolding around him. The arrows were coming from 3 directions, from the slopes on either side of the pool and from the rocky outcroppings ahead. It was a perfectly coordinated ambush, timed to catch the English column at its most vulnerable moment, when they were strung out in single file with no room to maneuver. Behind him, he could hear the screams of men and horses as the Welsh arrows found their marks. Sir Geoffrey's voice rose above the chaos, shouting orders that were barely audible over the din of battle. "Shields up! Close ranks! For God and England!" But there was little that shields could do against the storm of arrows that continued to fall upon them. The Welsh archers had positioned themselves with care, choosing angles that would allow their shots to find the gaps in armor, the vulnerable points where steel plates met or where mail provided the only protection. And they were shooting not just at the knights, but at their horses, the great destriers that were both the symbol and the substance of knightly power. The good knight's horse staggered as another arrow struck its flank, and he felt the animal's strength beginning to fail. Around him, other knights were being dismounted as their own mounts fell or became too wounded to carry their riders. In the space of perhaps 30 seconds, the tactical situation had been completely reversed. Where moments before they had been a column of mounted knights, masters of the battlefield, they were now becoming a collection of individual warriors, each fighting for his own survival. A third arrow struck the good knight's helmet, the impact ringing through his skull like the tolling of a great bell. The steel held, but the force of the blow left him momentarily stunned, his vision blurred and his ears ringing. Through the haze of pain and confusion, he could see Welsh warriors beginning to emerge from their concealment among the trees. They moved with the fluid grace of men who knew every root and stone of this forest, their weapons glinting in the dappled sunlight as they closed in for the kill. These were not the ragged bandits that English propaganda often portrayed Welsh rebels to be. They were skilled warriors, many of them veterans of previous conflicts with English forces. They wore leather jerkins reinforced with metal studs and carried spears whose points had been honed to razor sharpness. Some bore the scars of earlier battles, marks of honor that spoke of their willingness to face death in defense of their homeland. The good knight's horse finally collapsed, its legs folding beneath it as blood loss and shock overcame its strength. He threw himself clear of the falling animal, landing hard on the rocky ground beside the pool. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent a shock of pain through his ribs, but his armor had protected him from serious injury. He rolled to his feet, drawing his sword in a motion that had been practiced so many times it had become instinctive. Around him, the battle was becoming a series of individual combats as the surviving English knights found themselves separated from their comrades by the chaos of the ambush. The narrow path that had seemed merely inconvenient during their advance had now become a death trap, preventing them from forming the tight formations that were the foundation of knightly tactics. Sir Geoffrey was fighting desperately against two Welsh spearmen, his sword flashing in the dim light as he tried to keep their points away from the gaps in his armor. The older knight was skilled and experienced, but he was also fighting on foot in terrain that favored his enemies. Even as the good knight watched, one of the Welsh warriors managed to work his spear point into the joint at Geoffrey's shoulder, drawing blood and a cry of pain. The good knight started toward his comrade, but his path was blocked by a Welsh warrior who seemed to materialize from the undergrowth like a forest spirit. The man was young, perhaps no more than 20, but his eyes held the hard gleam of someone who had already seen too much of war. He carried a long spear in his hands, its ash shaft polished smooth by use, its iron point bright with recent sharpening. "English dog," the young Welshman snarled in accented but clear English. "You'll find no easy victories here." The good knight said nothing in reply. He had learned long ago that words were wasted in the heat of battle, that actions spoke more clearly than any speech. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, bringing his sword to a guard position that would allow him to respond to an attack from any direction. The Welsh warrior lunged forward, his spear point aimed at the gap beneath the good knight's arm, where the plates of his armor met. It was a skilled attack, precisely targeted at one of the few vulnerable points in his defense. But the good knight had faced spearmen before, had learned their rhythms and their weaknesses through centuries of combat. He sidestepped the thrust, his sword coming up to deflect the spear point away from his body. The Welsh warrior tried to recover, pulling back his weapon for another attack, but the good knight was already inside his guard. The longsword came down in a diagonal cut that would have split the young man's skull if it had connected cleanly. But the Welshman was quick, throwing himself backward and raising his spear shaft to block the blow. The sword bit deep into the ash wood, sending splinters flying, but did not cut through completely. For a moment, the two weapons were locked together, and the good knight found himself looking directly into his opponent's eyes. What he saw there was not hatred exactly, but something deeper and more complex. There was determination, certainly, and courage that could not be questioned. But there was also a kind of desperate sadness, the look of a man who was fighting not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. This young warrior was defending his homeland, his people, his way of life. In other circumstances, the good knight might have respected such dedication. But circumstances were what they were, and only one of them would walk away from this encounter. The Welshman wrenched his spear free and stepped back, circling to his left as he looked for another opening. The good knight turned with him, keeping his sword between them, waiting for the next attack. Around them, the battle continued to rage, the sounds of steel on steel mixing with the cries of wounded men and the splash of bodies falling into the pool. Another flight of arrows whistled overhead, and the good knight heard Sir William cry out as one of them found its mark. The young knight had been struck in the thigh, the arrow punching through his mail to lodge in the muscle beneath. He was still fighting, but his movements were becoming slower and more labored as blood loss began to take its toll. The Welsh warrior facing the good knight chose that moment to attack again, perhaps hoping that the distraction of his comrade's wound would create an opening. His spear came forward in a series of quick thrusts, each one aimed at a different target. First the throat, then the armpit, then the groin. It was a display of skill that spoke of long training and natural talent. But the good knight had faced such attacks before, in other battles, other times. His sword moved in a complex pattern of parries and ripostes, each motion flowing into the next with the fluid grace of a master swordsman. He gave ground slowly, drawing his opponent forward, waiting for the moment when aggression would overcome caution and create the opening he needed. That moment came when the young Welshman, frustrated by his inability to penetrate the good knight's defense, committed himself to a powerful thrust aimed at the center of his opponent's chest. It was a strong attack, delivered with all the force that desperation could provide, but it was also predictable. The good knight sidestepped the thrust and brought his sword around in a horizontal cut that caught the Welsh warrior in the side, just below his leather jerkin. The blade bit deep, cutting through cloth and flesh to grate against bone. The young man gasped, his spear falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched at the wound. For a moment, their eyes met again, and the good knight saw the light beginning to fade from his opponent's gaze. The young warrior tried to speak, perhaps to curse his killer or to call upon his gods, but only blood came from his lips. He fell to his knees, then toppled forward to lie still beside the pool that was already beginning to turn red with the blood of the fallen. The good knight felt no satisfaction in the kill. This young man had been brave, skilled, fighting for a cause he believed in. In another time, another place, they might have been allies rather than enemies. But war made enemies of men who might otherwise have been friends, and honor demanded that each fight to the best of his ability, regardless of personal feelings. A shout from behind him brought the good knight's attention back to the larger battle. Sir Geoffrey was down, overwhelmed by the Welsh warriors who had been pressing him. The older knight was still alive, but barely, his armor dented and blooded, his sword lying just beyond his reach. One of his opponents was raising a war hammer for what would surely be the killing blow. The good knight moved without conscious thought, his body responding to the crisis with the speed that only long experience could provide. He covered the distance between himself and Geoffrey's attackers in 3 quick strides, his sword coming up to block the descending hammer. The impact sent shockwaves up his arms, but his blade held, and the Welsh warrior staggered backward under the force of the collision. "Get up, Geoffrey," the good knight said quietly, not taking his eyes off the enemies who were now circling them both. "We're not finished yet." The older knight struggled to his feet, retrieving his sword with hands that shook from exhaustion and blood loss. "My thanks," he gasped. "I thought I was done for." "We may yet be," the good knight replied grimly, "but we'll make them pay dearly for it." Around them, the remnants of the English column were fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. Of the 20 knights who had entered Blackwood Glen that morning, perhaps half were still on their feet. The others lay dead or dying among the rocks and ferns, their bright armor dulled with blood and mud. The Welsh warriors pressed their attack with the fury of men who knew that victory was within their grasp. They had planned this ambush carefully, choosing their ground and their moment with the skill of experienced fighters. Now they were reaping the rewards of their preparation, watching their ancient enemies fall before their spears and arrows. But even in defeat, the English knights fought with the courage and skill that had made them feared across Europe. They formed a rough circle around the pool, their backs to the water, their weapons facing outward toward the enemies who surrounded them. It was a defensive formation born of desperation, but it was also one that allowed them to support each other and make the most of their remaining strength. The good knight found himself at the center of this formation, his silver armor making him a natural focal point for both his own men and their enemies. Welsh arrows continued to fall among them, but with less effect now that the knights had been able to raise their shields and present smaller targets. The real danger now came from the spearmen, who were closing in from all sides. their weapons probing for gaps in the English defense. "Hold fast!" the good knight called to his men. "Make them come to us. Every moment we delay gives us a chance for rescue or escape." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that rescue was unlikely. They were deep in Welsh territory, far from any English stronghold. Their only hope lay in fighting their way out of the trap, in breaking through the circle of enemies and reaching ground where their superior armor and training might give them an advantage. The thought had barely formed in his mind when the Welsh attack intensified. Warriors emerged from the forest on all sides, their war cries echoing from the surrounding hills as they charged toward the embattled English knights. It was the moment of decision, the point at which the battle would be won or lost. The good knight raised his sword, feeling its familiar weight in his hands, and prepared to meet the storm. The Welsh charge came like a breaking wave, a surge of desperate men driven by generations of accumulated grievance and the intoxicating scent of victory. They poured down the slopes from all directions, their feet sure on the treacherous ground, their weapons glinting in the filtered sunlight that struggled through the forest canopy. The sound of their approach was like thunder rolling through the glen, the crash of feet against stone, the rattle of spear shafts against leather armor, and above it all, the wild ululation of voices raised in the ancient war songs of their people. The good knight stood at the center of the English formation, his silver armor now bearing the scars of battle, dents from hammer blows, scratches from spear points, and the dark stains of blood, both his own and that of his enemies. Around him, the surviving knights had formed a rough circle, their shields locked together in the manner their grandfathers had learned fighting the Scots, their weapons bristling outward like the spines of some great hedgehog. But this was not the disciplined shield wall of Saxon warriors or the ordered ranks of Norman knights. This was the desperate formation of men who knew they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, who had been caught in a trap of their enemies' making, and now faced the choice between death and dishonor. Some might have chosen dishonor, thrown down their weapons and begged for mercy. But these were knights of England, men who had sworn oaths that bound them more tightly than chains of steel. Sir Geoffrey stood to the good knight's right, his greying beard matted with blood from a cut on his scalp, his sword arm trembling with exhaustion, but still steady enough to hold his blade in line. To his left was Sir William, the young knight whose enthusiasm for battle had been tempered by the harsh reality of Welsh steel. An arrow shaft protruded from his thigh, and his face was pale with blood loss, but his eyes still burned with the fierce determination of youth. "They mean to overwhelm us with numbers," Geoffrey said quietly, his voice barely audible over the approaching din. "Rush us all at once and trust to their spears to find the gaps in our armor." The good knight nodded grimly. It was a sound tactic, one that he had seen employed successfully in other battles, other times. The Welsh had already demonstrated their skill at ambush and archery. Now they would test their courage in close combat, trusting to their knowledge of the terrain and their superior numbers to carry the day. "Let them come," he replied, his voice carrying clearly to the other knights in their small circle. "We are few, but we are knights of England. We have faced worse odds than this and prevailed." It was not entirely true. Few battles in his long experience had presented such hopeless circumstances, but it was what his men needed to hear. In moments like this, when death seemed certain and defeat inevitable, a commander's most important weapon was not his sword, but his voice, his ability to inspire courage in the hearts of men who had every reason to despair. The first Welsh warriors reached the edge of their formation, and the battle became a chaos of individual combats, fought within the space of a few dozen yards. The sound was overwhelming, the clash of steel on steel, the thud of weapons against shields, the grunts and cries of men locked in mortal combat, the air filled with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of fear sweat, while underfoot the ground became slippery with mud and gore. A Welsh spearman thrust at the good knight's chest, his weapon aimed at the joint where breastplate met shoulder guard. The attack was skillfully delivered, timed to coincide with similar strikes from two other directions, but the good knight had faced such coordinated assaults before. His sword came up in a circular parry that deflected the spear point, while simultaneously positioning his blade for a riposte. The counterattack came as a thrust to the throat, delivered with all the precision that centuries of practice could provide. The Welsh warrior tried to pull back, but he was too close, too committed to his own attack. The sword point found the gap between his leather collar and the mail coif that protected his neck, sliding through flesh and sinew to sever the great vessels beneath. The man fell without a sound, his lifeblood pumping out onto the stones beside the pool. But even as he died, another warrior took his place, and then another. The Welsh seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of fighters, men who emerged from the forest shadows like spirits of the wood itself. To his right, Sir Geoffrey was fighting desperately against two opponents, his sword work still precise despite his wounds and exhaustion. The older knight had learned his craft in the Scottish wars, where survival depended on economy of motion and the ability to make every stroke count. His blade moved in tight, controlled arcs, each cut or thrust designed to disable or kill rather than merely wound. But even skill had its limits when faced with overwhelming numbers. As the good knight watched, a third Welsh warrior joined the attack on Geoffrey, coming at him from an angle that the older knight could not cover. The man carried a war hammer, its iron head designed to crush armor rather than cut through it, and he swung it with the practiced ease of a craftsman using a familiar tool. The blow caught Geoffrey in the ribs, the impact driving him to his knees despite the protection of his mail. The older knight tried to rise, but his strength was failing, and the Welsh warriors pressed their advantage with the ruthless efficiency of predators sensing wounded prey. The good knight moved to help his comrade, but his own opponents gave him no respite. A spear point scraped along his helmet, the steel shrieking against steel as it sought the eye slits of his visor. He twisted away from the thrust, his own sword coming around in a horizontal cut that opened his attacker's belly from hip to hip. The wounded man screamed and fell backward, clutching at his ruined abdomen, but his place was immediately taken by another warrior. This one was older, his face marked by the scars of previous battles, his movements showing the careful precision of a veteran fighter. He carried a long-handled axe, its blade honed to a razor edge, and he wielded it with the confidence of a man who had used it to kill before. The axe came down in a vertical cut aimed at the good knight's shoulder, where the plates of his armor met at a vulnerable joint. It was a powerful blow, delivered with all the strength that desperation could provide. But the good knight had faced axemen before. He sidestepped the attack and brought his sword up in an ascending cut that caught his opponent under the chin, the blade sliding through the gap between helmet and gorget to find the soft flesh beneath. The Welsh warrior toppled backward, his axe falling from nerveless fingers, but the good knight had no time to savor the victory. Around him, the circle of English knights was contracting as their numbers dwindled and their enemies pressed closer. Sir William had fallen, overwhelmed by a group of Welsh spearmen who had worked together to bring him down. His young face was peaceful in death, but his sword was still clutched in his hand, and the bodies of his enemies lay scattered around him. Sir Geoffrey was still fighting, but barely. The older knight had taken several wounds, and his movements were becoming slower and more labored with each passing moment. Blood ran freely from a gash in his scalp, and his breathing was harsh and ragged. Yet still he fought on, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, his training and experience carrying him forward even as his strength failed. The good knight found himself thinking of all the battles he had fought, all the men he had seen die in the service of causes both great and small. There was a terrible sameness to it all. The clash of weapons, the cries of the wounded, the smell of blood and death. Yet each battle was also unique, shaped by the men who fought it and the ground on which it was contested. This battle, he realized, was already lost. The Welsh had planned their ambush too well, chosen their ground too carefully. The English knights, for all their skill and courage, had been caught at a fatal disadvantage. Their horses were dead or dying, their formation broken, their numbers reduced to a handful of desperate men fighting for their lives. But even in defeat, there could be honor. Even in death, there could be meaning. The good knight had learned this lesson in 100 battles across the centuries, that how a man died mattered as much as how he lived, that courage in the face of hopeless odds could inspire others long after the battle itself was forgotten. A Welsh arrow struck his breastplate, the point skittering across the steel before embedding itself in the leather of his sword belt. The archer who had shot it was perched on a rocky outcropping perhaps 30 yards away, his longbow already nocked with another arrow. The good knight could see the man's face clearly, young, determined, his eyes bright with the fever of battle. The second arrow came a moment later, aimed at the gap beneath his arm where the plates of his armor met. It was a skilled shot, precisely targeted, but the good knight was already moving. He threw himself to one side, the arrow passing so close to his head that he could feel the wind of its passage. As he rolled, his hand found a loose stone, and without conscious thought he hurled it at the archer with all the strength he could muster. The stone struck the Welsh bowman in the chest, knocking him backward off his perch. The man fell with a cry that was cut short as he struck the rocks below, his bow clattering away into the undergrowth. It was a small victory, but in the desperate circumstances of the moment, even small victories mattered. The good knight regained his feet just in time to meet the charge of another Welsh warrior, this one armed with a long spear and a shield painted with the red dragon of Wales. The man was skilled, his attacks coordinated and precise, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of desperation rather than confidence. Perhaps he too could see how the battle was going, could sense that victory, while certain, was coming at a higher cost than anyone had expected. Their weapons met in a shower of sparks, steel ringing against steel in the ancient music of combat. The Welsh warrior was strong and fast, but the good knight had advantages that went beyond mere physical prowess. He had fought in more battles than this young man had seen summers, had learned lessons written in blood and steel across the centuries. The spear point came at him in a series of quick thrusts, each one aimed at a different target. The good knight's sword moved to meet each attack, his blade describing complex patterns in the air as he parried and riposted with the fluid grace of a master swordsman. Gradually, he began to take control of the fight, his superior experience allowing him to dictate the rhythm of the combat. The end came suddenly, as it often did in single combat. The Welsh warrior, growing frustrated by his inability to penetrate his opponent's defense, committed himself to a powerful thrust aimed at the good knight's heart. It was a strong attack, delivered with all the force that desperation could provide, but it was also predictable. The good knight sidestepped the thrust and brought his sword around in a diagonal cut that caught his opponent in the neck, just below the rim of his helmet. The blade bit deep, cutting through mail and flesh to sever the great vessels beneath. The Welsh warrior fell without a sound, his lifeblood pumping out onto the stones of the glen. But even as one enemy fell, others took his place. The Welsh seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of fighters, men who emerged from the forest like spirits of the wood itself. They pressed their attack with the fury of men who knew that victory was within their grasp, that one final push would break the last resistance of their ancient enemies. The good knight looked around at what remained of his force and felt his heart sink. Of the 20 knights who had entered Blackwood Glen that morning, only 5 were still on their feet. Sir Geoffrey was among them, but barely. The older knight was swaying on his feet, his sword held more by will than strength. The others were in little better condition, their armor dented and blooded, their movements growing slower with each passing moment. They could not hold much longer. The Welsh had too many men, too many advantages. Soon, very soon, the last of the English knights would fall, and Blackwood Glen would claim another victory for the rebels who called it home. But not yet. Not while he still drew breath, not while his sword arm still had strength to wield a blade. The good knight raised his weapon one more time, feeling its familiar weight in his hands, and prepared to meet whatever fate the forest had in store for him. The Welsh warriors sensed that the end was near. Their war cries grew louder, more triumphant, as they pressed forward for what they hoped would be the final assault. They came from all directions at once, a tide of spear points and axe blades that seemed to fill the entire world, and in the center of it all, his silver armor gleaming like a beacon in the forest gloom, the good knight stood ready to meet them. In the moments before what seemed certain to be the final assault, time itself appeared to slow for the good knight. The charging Welsh warriors moved as if through thick honey, their war cries stretching into long, mournful wails that seemed to echo from some distant realm. The forest around them took on an almost dreamlike quality, each leaf and shadow rendered with crystalline clarity, as if his mind was desperately trying to record every detail of what might be his last moments on Earth. He had experienced this phenomenon before, in other battles, other desperate hours when death had seemed inevitable. It was as if consciousness itself rebelled against the prospect of extinction, slowing the passage of time to allow for one final perfect moment of awareness. In these suspended seconds, he found his thoughts turning not to the immediate danger that surrounded him, but to the long path that had brought him to this place. How many battles had he fought? How many men had fallen beneath his sword? The numbers were beyond counting, lost in the mists of memory that stretched back through centuries of conflict. He had stood with William at Hastings, had charged with Richard at Arsuf, had held the walls at Acre as the Saracens pressed their final assault. Through it all, his silver armor had protected him, his skill had preserved him, and some inexplicable force had carried him forward through the years when other men grew old and died. But perhaps that long journey was finally coming to an end. Perhaps here, in this forgotten glen in the Welsh borderlands, the thread that had bound him to life for so long would finally be cut. There would be a certain justice in it, to die not in some grand battle that would be remembered by chroniclers and sung by poets, but in a small skirmish that would be forgotten within a generation, known only to the men who fought it and the families who mourned its casualties. The thought brought with it not fear, but a strange sense of peace. He had lived longer than any man had a right to expect, had seen empires rise and fall, had witnessed the slow transformation of the world from the ancient patterns of his youth to the complex realities of the present age. If this was to be his ending, then so be it. He would meet death as he had met life, with his sword in his hand and his honor intact. The Welsh warriors were almost upon them now, their faces twisted with the fury of men who had suffered too long under foreign rule and now saw their chance for revenge. At their head ran a man who seemed to embody all the wild spirit of his people. Tall and lean, his dark hair streaming behind him like a banner, his eyes blazing with the fire of absolute conviction. He carried a great two-handed sword, its blade gleaming with the dull sheen of well-maintained steel. And he wielded it with the easy confidence of a master. This, the good knight realized, was no common warrior but a leader, perhaps even the architect of the ambush that had trapped them. There was something in the man's bearing, in the way the other Welsh fighters seemed to take their cue from his movements, that spoke of command authority earned through deed rather than birth. This was a man who had proven himself in battle, who had earned the right to lead through courage and skill rather than noble blood. Their eyes met across the narrowing distance, and the good knight saw in his opponent's gaze a recognition that mirrored his own. Here were two warriors, each the product of his own culture and training, each committed to causes that made them mortal enemies, despite any personal respect they might feel for one another. In another time, another place, they might have been allies, might have fought side by side against common foes, but fate had made them enemies, and honor demanded that each fight to the best of his ability. The Welsh leader's sword came down in a vertical cut that would have split the good knight's skull if it had connected cleanly. But the English knight was already moving, his own blade coming up to meet the attack in a parry that sent sparks flying from the collision of steel on steel. The impact sent shock waves up both men's arms, but neither gave ground, each recognizing in the other a worthy opponent who would not be easily defeated. Around them, the final phase of the battle erupted in all its savage fury. The remaining English knights, reduced now to perhaps 4 men still capable of fighting, found themselves completely surrounded by Welsh warriors who pressed their attack with the desperate intensity of men who knew that victory was within their grasp. The sound was overwhelming, the clash of weapons, the cries of wounded men, the splash of bodies falling into the blood-darkened pool. Sir Geoffrey, his strength finally failing, went down beneath the spears of 3 Welsh warriors who had worked together to bring him to his knees. The older knight fought to the end, his sword still moving in the precise patterns that training had burned into his very bones, but numbers and exhaustion finally overcame skill and experience. His last act was to take one of his killers with him, his blade finding the gap in the man's leather armor even as the Welsh spears found their mark. The good knight saw his old comrade fall, but he could spare no attention for grief or regret. The Welsh leader was pressing his attack with relentless intensity, his great sword describing deadly arcs through the air as he sought to break through his opponent's defense. Each blow was delivered with perfect technique, the product of years of training and natural talent honed by the harsh realities of border warfare. But the good knight had advantages that went beyond mere skill with a blade. He had fought men like this before, warriors whose strength and speed were formidable, but whose experience was limited to the conflicts of a single generation. The patterns of combat, the rhythms of attack and defense, the subtle signs that preceded each type of strike, all of these were as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to take control of the fight. His parries became more economical, his ripostes more precise. Where the Welsh leader fought with the passionate intensity of a man defending his homeland, the good knight fought with the cold efficiency of a professional who had learned to conserve his strength for the moments when it would matter most. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The Welsh leader, growing frustrated by his inability to penetrate his opponent's defense, committed himself to a powerful overhead strike that left him momentarily off balance. The good knight's counterattack was a simple thrust to the heart, delivered with all the precision that centuries of practice could provide. The Welsh leader's eyes widened in surprise, then slowly filled with something that might have been respect. He tried to speak, perhaps to offer some final words of defiance or to acknowledge his opponent's skill, but only blood came from his lips. He fell forward, his great sword clattering on the stones, and lay still beside the pool that had become the grave of so many brave men. But even the death of their leader did not break the Welsh attack. If anything, it seemed to intensify their fury, as if the loss of their commander had transformed their desire for victory into a need for vengeance. They pressed forward with renewed vigor, their weapons seeking the gaps in the good knight's armor with the desperate precision of men who knew that this might be their only chance to strike a decisive blow against their oppressors. The good knight found himself fighting alone now, the last survivor of the English column that had entered Blackwood Glen with such confidence that morning. Around him lay the bodies of his comrades, good men who had died in service to their king and their conception of honor. Their sacrifice would not be remembered by history, would not be commemorated in stone or song, but it had meaning nonetheless, the meaning that came from duty fulfilled and oaths kept, even unto death. A Welsh spear thrust caught him in the side, the point sliding between the plates of his armor to draw blood from the flesh beneath. The wound was not mortal, but it was a reminder of his mortality, a sign that even his legendary endurance had limits. He could feel his strength beginning to ebb, could sense the accumulated fatigue of the long battle beginning to slow his reflexes and dull his responses. Another spear point scraped along his helmet, seeking the eye slits of his visor. He twisted away from the thrust, his own sword coming around in a horizontal cut that opened his attacker's throat in a spray of crimson. The man fell backward, clutching at his ruined neck, but his place was immediately taken by another warrior, and then another. They seemed endless, these Welsh fighters, as if the forest itself was spawning them from its depths. Each one who fell was replaced by two more. Each attack that was repelled was followed by another from a different angle. The good knight's world had contracted to a circle, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, bounded by the reach of his sword and the limits of his endurance. His breathing was becoming labored now, the weight of his armor pressing down upon him like a physical burden. Sweat ran freely beneath his helmet, stinging his eyes and making his grip slippery on his sword hilt. The wound in his side was bleeding steadily, and he could feel the warm wetness spreading across his ribs beneath the steel plates that protected his torso. But still he fought on, driven by something deeper than mere stubbornness or professional pride. It was as if all the battles he had ever fought, all the oaths he had ever sworn, all the men he had ever served with, were somehow present in this moment, demanding that he not yield, that he not surrender, that he continue to stand and fight until the very end. A warhammer struck his shoulder, the impact driving him to one knee despite the protection of his armor. The Welsh warrior who had delivered the blow raised his weapon for another strike, his face twisted with the savage joy of a man who sensed victory within his grasp. But the good knight was not finished yet. His sword came up in an ascending thrust that caught his attacker under the chin, the blade sliding through flesh and bone to emerge from the top of the man's skull. The Welsh warrior toppled backward, his hammer falling from nerveless fingers, but the effort of the killing stroke had cost the good knight dearly. He struggled to regain his feet, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. Around him, the remaining Welsh fighters sensed his weakness and pressed their advantage with the ruthless efficiency of predators closing in for the kill. A spear point found the gap at his elbow, sliding through the joint in his armor to grate against bone. Another thrust caught him in the thigh, the steel penetrating his mail to draw blood from the muscle beneath. Each wound was small in itself, but together they were beginning to tell, sapping his strength and slowing his responses. The good knight's thoughts turned to the long journey that had brought him to this place, to all the battles he had fought and all the men he had known. He thought of kings and peasants, of knights and foot soldiers, of all the countless individuals who had crossed his path during the long centuries of his existence. Most of them were dust now, their names forgotten, their deeds unremembered. Soon, perhaps, he would join them in that final democracy of death, where all distinctions of rank and birth were meaningless. But not yet. Not while he still drew breath, not while his sword arm still had strength to wield a blade. He raised his weapon one more time, feeling its familiar weight in his hands, and prepared to meet whatever fate the forest had in store for him. The Welsh warriors came at him from all sides, their weapons glinting in the filtered sunlight, their voices raised in the ancient war cries of their people. And in the center of their charge, his silver armor gleaming like a beacon in the forest gloom, the good knight stood ready to meet them, as he had met so many enemies before, with courage and honor and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth dying for. The circle was closing now, tightening around him like a noose. Soon, very soon, it would all be over. But until that moment came, he would continue to fight, continue to stand, continue to be what he had always been, a knight in service to something greater than himself, a guardian of ideals that transcended the petty concerns of any single battle or any single life. The forest held its breath, waiting for the final act of the drama that had been playing out in its depths. And in that moment of suspended time, the good knight prepared to write the last chapter of his long story with steel and blood and the kind of courage that poets would sing of, if only they knew. The final assault came not as a single coordinated charge, but as a gradual tightening of the circle, like the slow constriction of a serpent around its prey. The Welsh warriors moved with the patient confidence of hunters who knew their quarry was wounded and exhausted. That victory was no longer a matter of if, but when. They had learned to respect the skill of this silver-armored knight, who had already sent so many of their comrades to whatever afterlife awaited warriors who died with weapons in their hands. The good knight could feel the weight of their collective gaze upon him, could sense the mixture of hatred and grudging admiration that colored their perception of this lone English survivor. He had become, in these final moments, something more than just an enemy to be defeated. He had become a symbol of everything they fought against, and everything they secretly feared they might never overcome. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps now, each inhalation a conscious effort that sent spikes of pain through his wounded ribs. The blood from his various wounds had begun to pool in the bottom of his armor, creating a warm, sticky sensation against his skin that spoke eloquently of his body's gradual failure. Yet his sword arm remained steady, his grip on the leather-wrapped hilt as firm as it had been at the beginning of the battle. Around him, the forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The ancient oaks and hazels that crowned the slopes of Blackwood Glen had witnessed countless such scenes over the centuries. Romans fighting Britons, Saxons battling Danes, Normans crushing Anglo-Saxon resistance. Now they bore silent witness to another chapter in the endless story of conquest and resistance, of men dying for causes they believed in with the passionate intensity that only proximity to death could provide. A young Welsh warrior, perhaps no more than 16, stepped forward from the circle of his elders. His face was unmarked by the scars of previous battles, his eyes bright with the kind of courage that came from inexperience rather than wisdom. He carried a long spear, its ash shaft polished smooth by nervous hands, its iron point gleaming with the dull sheen of well-maintained steel. "Surrender, English dog!" the boy called out, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You have fought well, but it is over. Yield now, and we will grant you a clean death." The good knight looked at the young face before him and saw something that made his heart ache with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. This boy reminded him of so many others he had known over the centuries, young men who had gone to war with songs on their lips and glory in their hearts, only to discover that battle was not the romantic adventure that poets made it seem. "I am a knight," he replied quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the forest stillness. "I do not yield." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of centuries of tradition, of oaths sworn and honor maintained even unto death. They were the words of a man who had chosen his path long ago and would not deviate from it now, regardless of the consequences. The young Welshman's face hardened at the refusal, and he raised his spear with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from fear or excitement, the good knight could not tell. Around the circle, the other warriors shifted restlessly, their weapons catching the filtered sunlight as they prepared for what they all knew would be the final act of this bloody drama. But before the boy could strike, an older voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Hold." The command came from a figure who emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, an elderly man whose white beard and deeply lined face spoke of many years and much wisdom. He wore no armor save for a leather jerkin reinforced with iron studs, but there was something in his bearing that commanded instant respect from the younger warriors around him. This was clearly a man of authority, perhaps a chieftain or war leader whose word carried the weight of law among his people. The old man approached slowly, his eyes never leaving the good knight's face. When he spoke again, his voice was measured and thoughtful, the voice of someone who had seen enough of war to understand its true cost. "You have fought with honor, English knight," he said, his accent thick but his words clear. "Your men died well, and you have proven yourself worthy of respect. But this battle is over. Your king's authority ends here, in these woods. Will you not reconsider? There is no shame in acknowledging defeat when you have fought so bravely." The good knight studied the old man's face, seeing in it the kind of weathered dignity that came from a lifetime of difficult decisions and hard-won wisdom. This was not a man who spoke lightly of honor or death, not someone who would make empty promises or false offers of mercy. If he said there was a way out of this situation that did not end in bloodshed, then perhaps there truly was. For a moment, the good knight found himself wavering. The rational part of his mind pointed out that his mission was already a failure, that his men were dead, that continuing to fight would accomplish nothing except to add his own corpse to the pile of bodies that littered the glen. What would be gained by dying here? What purpose would be served by this final, futile gesture of defiance? But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, he knew what his answer had to be. He was not just a man, but a symbol, a representative of English authority in these disputed borderlands. To surrender now, to acknowledge defeat and beg for mercy, would be to hand the Welsh rebels a victory that would echo far beyond this single encounter. It would be a sign that English rule was not absolute, that resistance was possible, that the king's knights could be beaten by determined men fighting on their own ground. More than that, it would be a betrayal of everything he had sworn to uphold. The oaths he had taken were not conditional, not subject to revision when circumstances became difficult. They bound him as surely as chains of steel, and to break them now would be to destroy everything that gave his long existence meaning. "I thank you for your courtesy," he said finally, his voice steady despite the pain that racked his body. "But I cannot accept your offer. I am sworn to my king and to my duty. I will not yield while I still draw breath." The old man's face showed no surprise at the refusal, only a kind of sad resignation that spoke of too many such encounters, too many brave men who had chosen death over dishonor. He nodded slowly, then stepped back to rejoin the circle of warriors who surrounded the lone English knight. "So be it," he said quietly. "You have chosen your path, and we must respect it. But know that your courage will be remembered, even by your enemies." The words were meant as a comfort, perhaps, but they brought the good knight no peace. He had heard similar sentiments before, in other battles, other desperate hours. They were the kind of thing that men said when they were about to kill someone they respected, a way of salving their consciences while still doing what necessity demanded. The circle began to contract again, the Welsh warriors moving with the slow, deliberate pace of men who knew that their victory was assured. There was no longer any urgency in their movements, no fear that their prey might somehow escape. They were simply completing a task that had already been decided, bringing to its inevitable conclusion a story that could have only one ending. The good knight raised his sword one final time, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. The blade was notched and stained with blood, its once bright steel dulled by the hard use of battle, but it was still a weapon worthy of a knight. It had served him well through countless encounters, had never failed him when he needed it most. Now it would serve him one last time, in this final moment when all his skill and experience would be tested against impossible odds. The young warrior with the spear was the first to move, his weapon coming forward in a thrust aimed at the good knight's chest. It was a good attack, well timed and precisely targeted, but the English knight had faced such strikes countless times before. His sword came up in a circular parry that deflected the spear point, while simultaneously positioning his blade for a riposte. The counterattack was a thrust to the throat, delivered with all the precision that centuries of practice could provide. The young Welshman tried to pull back, but he was too close, too committed to his own attack. The sword point found the gap between his leather collar and the mail coif that protected his neck, sliding through flesh and sinew to sever the great vessels beneath. The boy fell without a sound, his spear clattering on the stones beside the pool. His eyes, wide with surprise and the sudden understanding of mortality, stared up at the canopy of leaves above, seeing perhaps for the first time the beauty of the world he was leaving behind. But even as one enemy fell, others took his place. They came from all directions now, their weapons seeking the gaps in the good knight's armor, with the desperate precision of men who knew that this was their moment. That hesitation now would only prolong the agony for all concerned. A spear point found the joint at his knee, sliding through the gap in his armor to grate against bone. Another thrust caught him in the shoulder, the steel penetrating his mail to draw blood from the muscle beneath. Each wound was small in itself, but together they were beginning to tell, sapping his strength and slowing his responses. The good knight's world had contracted to a space perhaps 6 feet in diameter, bounded by the reach of his sword and the limits of his endurance. Beyond that narrow circle, the forest seemed to fade into a green blur, as if his vision was tunneling down to focus only on the immediate threats that surrounded him. His breathing was becoming more labored now, each inhalation a conscious effort that sent spikes of pain through his wounded chest. The blood from his various wounds had begun to soak through his padding, creating a warm, sticky sensation against his skin that spoke eloquently of his body's gradual failure. Yet still he fought on, driven by something deeper than mere stubbornness or professional pride. It was as if all the battles he had ever fought, all the oaths he had ever sworn, all the men he had ever served with, were somehow present in this moment, demanding that he not yield, that he not surrender, that he continue to stand and fight until the very end. A warhammer struck his helmet, the impact ringing through his skull like the tolling of a great bell. His vision blurred, and for a moment he staggered, his sword wavering in his grip. The Welsh warriors sensed his weakness and pressed their advantage, their weapons probing for the killing stroke that would end this long ordeal. But the good knight was not finished yet. Through sheer force of will, he steadied himself, his sword coming up to block a spear thrust that would have pierced his heart. The blade rang against the ash shaft, sending vibrations up his arm, but it held, and the attack was turned aside. His riposte was a horizontal cut that opened his attacker's belly from hip to hip. The man screamed and fell backward, clutching at his ruined abdomen, but his place was immediately taken by another warrior, and then another. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A spear thrust from behind, delivered by a warrior who had worked his way around to the good knight's blind side, found the gap beneath his arm where the plates of his armor met. The steel point slid between his ribs, piercing lung and heart with surgical precision. The good knight felt the blade enter his body, felt the sudden rush of warmth as his lifeblood began to flow. His sword fell from nerveless fingers, clattering on the stones beside the pool that had become the grave of so many brave men. He sank to his knees, his hands pressed against the wound that was stealing his life away, drop by precious drop. Around him, the Welsh warriors stepped back, their weapons lowered, their faces showing a mixture of relief and something that might have been regret. They had won their victory, had struck a blow against their oppressors that would be remembered and celebrated. But the cost had been higher than anyone had expected, and the manner of their enemy's death had earned him a respect that transcended the boundaries of nationality and allegiance. The old chieftain approached slowly, his weathered face grave with the solemnity of the moment. He knelt beside the dying knight, his eyes meeting those of his fallen enemy with something approaching compassion. "You fought well," he said quietly. "Your death will be remembered with honor." The good knight tried to speak, to offer some final words of defiance or acceptance, but only blood came from his lips. His vision was beginning to fade, the green canopy above growing dim and distant. Yet in those final moments he felt not fear, but a strange sense of peace, as if a burden he had carried for centuries was finally being lifted from his shoulders. The forest grew quiet around him, the sounds of battle fading into the whisper of wind through leaves and the gentle murmur of the stream that had witnessed so much death and would continue to flow long after all the participants in this drama had been forgotten. And in that silence, the good knight closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, secure in the knowledge that he had kept faith with his oaths until the very end. But death, it seemed, was not quite ready to claim him yet. Darkness came not as the sudden extinguishing of a candle, but as a gradual dimming of the world around him, like the slow approach of twilight on a winter's day. The good knight felt himself sinking into depths that seemed to have no bottom, his consciousness fragmenting into scattered pieces that drifted away like leaves on an autumn wind. The pain that had racked his body began to fade, replaced by a strange numbness that spread outward from his wounds like ripples on a still pond. Yet even as his physical form failed him, some essential part of his being remained stubbornly intact. It was as if there was a silver thread running through the core of his existence, something that could not be severed by mere steel or broken by the simple fact of dying. This thread had carried him through centuries of warfare, had bound him to life when other men would have gladly embraced death's release. Now, in what should have been his final moments, it pulsed with a faint but persistent light that refused to be extinguished. The voices of the Welsh warriors seemed to come from a great distance, their words echoing as if spoken in a vast cathedral. He could hear them discussing what to do with his body, whether to strip it of its valuable armor or to leave it as a mark of respect for a fallen enemy. Their tone was subdued, lacking the triumphant joy that might have been expected after such a hard-fought victory. "He was a brave one," someone was saying, the words floating through the gathering darkness like fragments of a half-remembered dream. "Fought like a man possessed, he did. Never seen the like." "Aye," came another voice, older and more weathered. "There's honor in such a death. We'll not dishonor his corpse with looting. Let him keep his silver armor. He's earned the right to wear it into whatever afterlife awaits Christian knights." The good knight tried to respond, to tell them that he was not yet dead, that the silver thread still bound him to the world of the living. But his body would not obey his will. His voice remained trapped behind lips that could no longer form words. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, aware but unable to act, conscious but powerless to affect the world around him. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this strange twilight state. Minutes might have passed, or hours. There was no way to tell. The voices of the Welsh warriors gradually faded as they moved away from his still form, leaving him alone beside the blood-darkened pool that had become the grave of so many brave men. The forest settled into the kind of deep quiet that comes only in the aftermath of violence, when even the birds and insects seem reluctant to break the silence that death has imposed. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the good knight became aware of changes taking place within his wounded body. The bleeding had stopped, not through the natural clotting of blood, but through some other process that he could not understand. The terrible wound beneath his arm, which should have been fatal, was beginning to close, the torn flesh knitting itself back together with a speed that defied all natural law. It was not the first time he had experienced such healing. Over the centuries, he had suffered wounds that should have killed him, had endured injuries that would have left other men crippled or dead. Always, somehow, his body had found a way to repair itself, to restore him to fighting condition, so that he could continue his long journey through the battlefields of history. He had never understood the mechanism behind this regeneration, had simply accepted it as one of the mysteries that surrounded his existence. Now, as consciousness slowly returned to his battered form, he found himself wondering once again about the nature of his condition. Was he truly immortal, or merely very difficult to kill? Was this healing a gift from some divine source, or the result of some curse that bound him to an existence he had never chosen? The questions had haunted him for centuries, but answers remained as elusive as ever. The first sensation to return was pain, not the sharp agony of fresh wounds, but the deep, throbbing ache of tissues that were rebuilding themselves at an unnatural pace. It felt as if his entire body was being torn apart and reassembled, every nerve ending screaming in protest at the violence being done to the natural order of things. He bit back a groan, not wanting to alert any Welsh warriors who might still be in the area to the fact that their supposedly dead enemy was returning to life. Slowly, carefully, he opened his eyes. The forest around him was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, suggesting that he had been unconscious for several hours. The bodies of his fallen comrades still lay where they had fallen, their armor dulled with blood, and their faces peaceful in death. Sir Geoffrey lay nearby, his greying beard matted with gore, his sword still clutched in his lifeless hand. The sight filled the good knight with a grief that was all the more poignant for being familiar. He had lost too many good men over the centuries, had watched too many friends die in service to causes both great and small. The Welsh warriors were nowhere to be seen, having apparently withdrawn deeper into the forest to celebrate their victory or to tend to their own wounded. The good knight was grateful for their absence. He had no desire to explain his miraculous recovery to men who would likely see it as evidence of witchcraft or demonic influence. Better to let them believe that the English knight had died, as men were supposed to die, cleanly and finally. He sat up slowly, testing the limits of his restored body. The wound that had pierced his heart was gone, leaving only a faint scar on his chest to mark where the spear point had entered. His other injuries had healed as well, though he could still feel the echo of their pain in his bones and muscles. It would be some time before he was fully restored to his former strength, but he was alive and functional, more than he had any right to expect after such a close encounter with death. His armor, miraculously, was largely intact. The Welsh warriors had been true to their word, leaving his silver mail and plate untouched out of respect for his courage in battle. The metal bore the scars of combat, dents from hammer blows, scratches from spear points, and dark stains that spoke of blood spilled and lives lost. But it was still serviceable, still capable of protecting him in whatever battles lay ahead. The good knight struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady after his long period of unconsciousness. The forest around him seemed different somehow, as if his brush with death had altered his perception of the world. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds more distinct, smells more intense. It was as if he was experiencing everything with heightened sensitivity, as if his senses had been sharpened by his journey to the very edge of existence. He walked slowly around the battlefield, paying his respects to the fallen. Each of his men had died bravely, fighting to the end despite impossible odds. They had been good soldiers, loyal knights who had followed him into this trap without question or complaint. Their deaths weighed heavily on his conscience, adding to the burden of guilt that he carried for all the men who had died under his command over the centuries. Sir Geoffrey's body lay beside the pool, his face turned toward the sky as if he had been watching the clouds in his final moments. The good knight knelt beside his old friend, closing the dead man's eyes with gentle fingers. Geoffrey had been a good knight and a better man, someone who had understood the true meaning of honor and duty. His death was a loss that would be felt far beyond this forgotten glen. "Forgive me, old friend," the good knight whispered, his voice barely audible in the forest stillness. "I led you into this trap. Your death is on my conscience, as are all the others." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that Geoffrey would not have blamed him for what had happened. The older knight had understood the risks of their mission, had accepted the possibility of death as part of his duty. He had died as he had lived, with courage and honor, fighting for something he believed in. There was comfort in that, even if it could not ease the pain of loss. The good knight rose and continued his circuit of the battlefield, gathering the weapons and personal effects of his fallen comrades. These items would need to be returned to their families, along with word of how their men had died. It was a duty he had performed too many times before, but one that never became easier with repetition. As he worked, his mind turned to the larger implications of what had happened here. The ambush at Blackwood Glen had been a tactical masterpiece, perfectly planned and flawlessly executed. The Welsh rebels had demonstrated a level of skill and coordination that spoke of experienced leadership and careful preparation. This had not been a spontaneous uprising, but a calculated strike designed to send a message to English authorities. That message was clear. English rule in the Welsh borderlands was not absolute. There were still men willing to fight and die for their independence, still places where the king's authority could be challenged with impunity. The death of 20 English knights would not go unnoticed by the garrison commanders, but neither would it necessarily lead to the kind of massive retaliation that might crush the rebellion once and for all. Instead, it would likely result in more expeditions like this one, more small battles fought in forgotten places by men whose names would never be recorded in the chronicles of history. It was the nature of frontier warfare, a slow, grinding conflict that consumed lives and resources without ever reaching a decisive conclusion. The good knight had seen it before, in other times and other places. It was the kind of war that could continue for generations, fed by grievances both real and imagined, sustained by the simple fact that some men would always prefer to fight rather than submit. The sun was beginning to set by the time he finished his grim task, painting the forest in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost mockingly beautiful after the day's violence. The good knight stood beside the pool, now stained permanently red with the blood of the fallen, and considered his options. He could return to the English garrison and report what had happened, could request reinforcements for another expedition into the Welsh territories. But what would that accomplish, except to send more good men to their deaths in these unforgiving woods? Alternatively, he could simply disappear, could use his apparent death as an opportunity to begin a new chapter in his long existence. The Welsh warriors believed him dead, and his own commanders would assume the same when he failed to return. He could shed his identity as an English knight and become something else, a wandering mercenary, perhaps, or a pilgrim seeking redemption for his many sins. But even as he considered these possibilities, he knew what he would do. He was bound by oaths that transcended death itself, committed to a duty that could not be abandoned simply because it had become inconvenient or dangerous. He would return to his commanders and report what had happened, would accept whatever consequences came from his failure to complete the mission. It was what honor demanded, and honor was all he had left after so many centuries of war and loss. The good knight began to walk towards the edge of the glen, his silver armor catching the last rays of sunlight as he moved through the gathering shadows. Behind him, the bodies of his comrades lay in their final rest, their sacrifice unmarked by monument or memorial, but not forgotten by the one man who had survived to remember them. As he reached the tree line, he paused and looked back one final time at the battlefield that had nearly claimed his life. The pool reflected the darkening sky like a mirror, its surface disturbed only by the gentle ripples created by the stream that fed it. In time, the forest would reclaim this place, would cover the bloodstains with new growth, and erase all traces of the violence that had occurred here. But the memory would remain, carried forward by the silver-armored knight, who had learned once again that death was not the end of his story, merely another chapter in a tale that seemed destined to continue until the end of time itself. The good knight turned away from the glen and began his long journey back to the world of the living, his footsteps echoing softly in the forest, stillness as he walked toward whatever fate awaited him in the days to come. The silver thread that bound him to existence remained unbroken, and with it, his duty to continue the endless vigil that had defined his existence for so many centuries. Behind him, Blackwood Glen settled into the peaceful quiet of evening, its secrets safe once more in the keeping of the ancient trees that had witnessed so much history and would witness so much more before their own time came to an end. The path that led away from Blackwood Glen seemed to stretch endlessly before the good knight, winding through a landscape that had been transformed by the day's events from familiar territory into something alien and threatening. Every shadow might conceal a Welsh archer, every rustle of leaves could herald another ambush. The forest that had seemed merely wild during their morning advance now felt actively hostile, as if the very trees themselves had taken sides in the ancient conflict between English authority and Welsh independence. His footsteps fell with measured cadence on the leaf-strewn ground, each step carrying him further from the scene of his apparent death, and closer to a reckoning that he was not sure he was prepared to face. The weight of his armor, which had felt natural and protective during the battle, now seemed to press down upon him like the burden of all his accumulated failures. 20 good men had followed him into Blackwood Glen that morning. Only he would emerge to tell the tale of their sacrifice. The evening air was cool against his face, carrying with it the scents of the forest, moss and earth, the green smell of growing things, and underneath it all, the faint but persistent odor of blood and death that seemed to cling to him like an invisible shroud. He had washed his hands and face in a stream some miles back, had tried to clean the worst of the gore from his armor, but he knew that the stains went deeper than mere physical contamination. They were written into his very soul, added to the countless other marks left by centuries of warfare. As he walked, his mind turned inevitably to the question that had haunted him since his miraculous recovery beside the blood-darkened pool. What was he, exactly? The question had tormented him for so long that it had become almost a companion, a familiar presence that accompanied him through the long years of his existence. He had been many things over the centuries, knight and soldier, leader and follower, victor and vanquished. But underneath all these roles lay something deeper, something that defied easy categorization. He remembered the first time he had died, or thought he had died, in a battle whose details had long since faded from memory. The sensation had been much the same. The gradual dimming of consciousness, the feeling of sinking into depths that seemed to have no bottom, followed by the slow, painful return to life. At first he had attributed his survival to luck, to the intervention of divine providence, to the simple fact that wounds which appeared mortal were sometimes less severe than they seemed. But as the years passed and the pattern repeated itself, he had been forced to confront the possibility that something fundamental about his nature set him apart from other men. He aged, but slowly. He could be wounded, but he healed with unnatural speed. He could die, but death seemed unable to hold him for long. It was as if he existed in a state of perpetual suspension between life and death, bound to neither, but touched by both. The implications of this condition were both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it meant that he could take risks that would be suicidal for other men, could throw himself into battles with the knowledge that even the worst wounds would eventually heal. On the other hand, it condemned him to watch everyone he cared about grow old and die while he remained essentially unchanged, a constant in a world of flux and impermanence. The loneliness of such an existence was perhaps its cruelest aspect. He had loved women who had aged and died while he remained young. He had formed friendships with men who had become fathers and grandfathers while he continued to appear as he had in his prime. He had served kings who had passed into legend while he soldiered on, carrying their memories like sacred relics in the cathedral of his mind. Sir Geoffrey had been one of the few who had suspected something of his true nature. The older knight had never spoken of it directly, but there had been moments, glances exchanged across a campfire, conversations that touched on the edges of deeper truths, when the good knight had sensed that his friend understood more than he let on. Geoffrey had been old enough to remember stories told by his own grandfather, tales of a silver-armored knight who had fought in battles that predated living memory. Now Geoffrey was dead, and with him died one of the few connections the good knight had to anything resembling normal human companionship. The thought filled him with a grief that was all the more poignant for being familiar. He had mourned too many friends over the centuries, had stood beside too many graves of men who had meant something to him. Each loss carved away another piece of his humanity, leaving him more isolated and alone. The path began to descend now, following the course of a small stream that chattered and gurgled over moss-covered stones. The sound was peaceful, almost hypnotic, and for a moment the good knight allowed himself to imagine that he was simply a traveler making his way through the countryside, unburdened by duty or the weight of impossible memories. But the illusion could not be sustained. The blood on his armor, the ache in his recently healed wounds, the knowledge of what awaited him at journey's end, all of these things anchored him firmly in the present reality. As the last light faded from the sky, he began to see the distant glow of torches marking the location of the English garrison. The sight should have brought him comfort, should have represented safety and the company of his own kind. Instead, it filled him with a deep sense of dread. How could he explain what had happened in Blackwood Glen? How could he make his commanders understand that their carefully planned expedition had walked into a trap so perfectly conceived that escape had been impossible? More troubling still was the question of his own survival. The Welsh warriors had left him for dead, and by all rights he should have been. The wound that had felled him had been mortal by any reasonable standard, the kind of injury that killed men quickly and without hope of recovery. His miraculous healing would raise questions that he was not prepared to answer, would invite scrutiny that might reveal truths better left hidden. He could claim that his wounds had appeared worse than they actually were, that the Welsh had been too hasty in assuming his death. It was a plausible explanation, one that would satisfy most casual inquiries, but there would be those who remembered other battles, other times when he had survived injuries that should have been fatal. Patterns had a way of emerging over time, and patterns invited investigation. The torches grew brighter as he approached the garrison, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the wooden palisade that surrounded the English stronghold. Guards would be posted at the gates, men who would recognize him and wonder at his solitary return. Word would spread quickly through the garrison that the expedition to Blackwood Glen had ended in disaster, that only one man had survived to tell the tale. The good knight paused at the edge of the cleared ground that surrounded the fortress, gathering his thoughts and preparing himself for the ordeal that lay ahead. He would need to be careful in his account of the battle, would need to emphasize the skill and courage of his fallen comrades while downplaying the circumstances of his own survival. The truth was too strange, too unsettling, to be shared with men who lived in a world where death was final and wounds healed according to natural law. A challenge rang out from the walls as he approached the gate, the voice of a sentry who had spotted his approach. "Who goes there? State your name and business." "Sir Marcus," he called back, using the name he had adopted for this particular incarnation of his existence. "Returning from patrol." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of hurried conversation from the walls above. The guards would be noting his solitary state, would be wondering what had become of the 20 knights who had ridden out with him that morning. Soon, very soon, he would have to provide answers to questions that had no satisfactory solutions. The gate creaked open, revealing the familiar interior of the garrison courtyard. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls, casting pools of yellow light that pushed back the darkness, but could not entirely banish it. Men emerged from the barracks and the great hall, their faces showing the mixture of relief and concern that came with the return of a patrol that had been expected hours earlier. Captain William de Montfort, the garrison commander, strode across the courtyard with the purposeful gait of a man accustomed to command. He was a veteran of the Scottish Wars, a competent soldier who had earned his position through merit rather than birth. His weathered face showed the strain of command in a hostile territory, the constant worry that came with being responsible for the lives of men in a place where death could come without warning. "Sir Marcus," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You return alone. What news of your patrol?" The good knight met the commander's gaze steadily, drawing upon centuries of experience in delivering unwelcome reports to superior officers. "Ambush, my lord. In Blackwood Glen, the Welsh were waiting for us." A murmur ran through the assembled men, a sound that spoke of fear and anger in equal measure. Ambushes were a constant threat in the borderlands, but the loss of an entire patrol was a serious blow to the garrison's strength and morale. "How many?" de Montfort asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "All of them, my lord. Sir Geoffrey, Sir William, all the others. I alone escaped to bring word." The captain's face hardened, his jaw clenching with the effort of controlling his emotions. Geoffrey had been his friend, as well as his subordinate, a man whose counsel he had valued and whose loss would be deeply felt. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. "Leave nothing out." And so the good knight began his carefully edited account of the battle, describing the approach to Blackwood Glen, the signs of ambush that had come too late to prevent disaster, the desperate fight beside the blood-darkened pool. He spoke of the courage of his men, of their refusal to yield even in the face of overwhelming odds. He described the skill of the Welsh warriors, their perfect coordination and intimate knowledge of the terrain. What he did not describe was his own death and resurrection, the spear thrust that had pierced his heart, the long hours of unconsciousness during which his body had healed itself through means he did not understand. Instead, he spoke of being knocked unconscious by a blow to the head, of awakening hours later to find the Welsh gone and his comrades dead around him. It was a plausible story, one that explained his survival without raising uncomfortable questions about his true nature. The assembled men listened in grim silence, their faces reflecting the mixture of grief and anger that came with news of fallen comrades. Some wept openly for friends who would not return, while others muttered oaths of vengeance against the Welsh rebels who had struck such a devastating blow. When he finished his account, de Montfort stood in silence for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the garrison. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions that would send more men to their deaths. "This cannot go unanswered," he said. "The Welsh must learn that English blood cannot be spilled without consequence. I will send word to the regional commander, request reinforcements for a punitive expedition." The good knight felt a familiar weariness settle over him like a heavy cloak. More expeditions, more battles, more good men dying in the endless cycle of violence that seemed to define the relationship between England and Wales. He had seen it all before, in other times and other places. The pattern never changed, only the faces of the dead. "With respect, my lord," he said carefully, "the Welsh chose their ground well. Blackwood Glen is a natural fortress, easily defended and difficult to assault. A larger force might suffer the same fate as ours." De Montfort's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or frustration. "Would you have us do nothing? Allow this insult to go unpunished?" "I would have us be wise, my lord. The Welsh are not fools. They will not remain in Blackwood Glen now that they have revealed their presence there. By the time reinforcements arrive, they will have melted back into the forest, leaving only empty woods for us to search." It was the truth, though not one that the captain wanted to hear. The nature of guerrilla warfare was such that conventional responses were often ineffective, that attempts at retaliation frequently struck at shadows rather than substance. The Welsh rebels understood this, had built their entire strategy around the principle of striking hard and then disappearing before their enemies could respond. But de Montfort was a soldier, trained to think in terms of action and reaction, of problems that could be solved through the application of sufficient force. The idea of allowing an attack to go unanswered was anathema to everything he had been taught about military leadership. "Nevertheless," he said firmly, We must try. To do otherwise would be to invite further attacks, to show weakness that our enemies will exploit. The good knight nodded, recognizing the futility of further argument. He had made his point, had offered his counsel based on centuries of experience with such conflicts. If de Montfort chose to ignore that advice, then the consequences would be on his head. "As you command, my lord," he said simply. The captain dismissed the assembled men with a gesture, sending them back to their duties with heavy hearts and troubled minds. The news of the disaster at Blackwood Glen would spread quickly through the garrison, would be carried by messengers to other English strongholds throughout the borderlands. Soon, the entire region would know that the Welsh rebels had struck a significant blow against their occupiers. As the courtyard emptied, de Montfort approached the good knight with the careful manner of a man who had something difficult to say. "You fought well today," he said quietly. "Your survival is a blessing, even if it comes at such a terrible cost. But I must ask, are you certain there was nothing more you could have done? No warning signs that might have been heeded? No tactical decisions that might have changed the outcome?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. The good knight understood what the captain was really asking, whether the disaster could have been prevented, whether the deaths of 20 good men could be laid at the feet of their surviving commander. "I have asked myself the same questions, my lord," he replied honestly. "We saw signs of ambush, but too late to avoid the trap. Perhaps a more cautious commander would have turned back at the first hint of danger. But our orders were clear: to seek out and engage the Welsh rebels. We did as we were commanded." De Montfort nodded slowly, seeming to accept the explanation. But the good knight could see the doubt in his eyes, the questions that would continue to gnaw at him in the days to come. Command was a lonely burden, made heavier by the knowledge that every decision carried the potential for disaster. "Get some rest," the captain said finally. "Tomorrow we begin planning our response. Your knowledge of the terrain will be valuable in that effort." The good knight bowed slightly and turned to go, but de Montfort's voice stopped him. "Marcus," the captain said, using his assumed name with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "I'm glad you survived. Geoffrey spoke highly of you, said you were one of the finest knights he had ever served with. His loss is grievous, but yours would have been equally so." The words were meant as comfort, but they only deepened the good knight's sense of isolation and guilt. If only de Montfort knew the truth, that he had died alongside his comrades, that his survival was not a matter of skill or luck, but of something far stranger and more troubling. The captain's praise felt like mockery, a reminder of the deception that lay at the heart of his existence. "Thank you, my lord," he said simply, then walked away across the courtyard toward the quarters that had been assigned to him. The small chamber was spartanly furnished: a narrow bed, a wooden chest for his belongings, a single window that looked out over the surrounding countryside. It was the kind of accommodation that suited a knight of modest means, someone who served for duty rather than glory. The good knight had occupied countless such rooms over the centuries, had learned to find comfort in their very anonymity. He removed his armor piece by piece, examining each component for damage that might need repair. The silver steel bore the scars of battle, dents and scratches that told the story of the day's violence. But it was still serviceable. Like its wearer, it had survived what should have been a fatal encounter, ready to serve again in whatever battles lay ahead. As he prepared for sleep, the good knight's thoughts turned once again to the question that had haunted him for so long. What was his purpose in this endless existence? Was he meant to be a guardian, protecting the innocent from the chaos of war? A witness, recording the deeds of mortal men for some cosmic accounting? Or was he simply a cosmic accident, a glitch in the natural order that condemned him to wander through history without purpose or meaning? The questions had no answers, at least none that he could discern. All he could do was continue forward, one day at a time, one battle at a time, carrying the memories of the fallen and the weight of his impossible existence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities for both heroism and failure. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his chamber, he allowed himself a moment of grief for the men who had died under his command, for the friends he had lost, for the burden of survival that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. The faces of the fallen rose before him in the darkness, Sir Geoffrey with his greying beard and weathered wisdom, young Sir William with his untested courage and bright dreams of glory, all the others who had followed him into Blackwood Glen with trust and loyalty that he felt he had betrayed. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. His dreams were filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel on steel, the screams of wounded men, the whistle of arrows through the forest air. He saw again the moment when the Welsh spear had pierced his heart, felt again the strange sensation of his life ebbing away only to return with the dawn. In his dreams, the dead spoke to him, asking why he lived while they had perished, demanding answers he could not provide. He woke before sunrise, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. The nightmares were nothing new. They had been his companions for centuries, growing more vivid and persistent with each battle he survived. Sometimes he wondered if they were a form of punishment, a reminder of the price that others had paid for his continued existence. The garrison was already stirring as he made his way to the great hall for the morning meal. Servants hurried about their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their lives depended on the smooth functioning of this military outpost. Soldiers gathered in small groups, their conversations subdued by the news of the previous day's disaster. The good knight could feel their eyes upon him as he passed, could sense the mixture of sympathy and suspicion that his survival had generated. Captain de Montfort was already at the high table, studying a collection of maps and documents that had been spread before him. His face showed the strain of a sleepless night, the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of the men under his command. He looked up as the good knight approached, gesturing for him to take a seat at his side. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," the captain said without preamble, "about the futility of pursuing the Welsh into their forest strongholds. Perhaps there is wisdom in your words, but I cannot simply ignore what happened at Blackwood Glen. The regional commander will expect action, and the men need to see that their comrades' deaths will be avenged." The good knight nodded, understanding the political realities that drove military decision-making. In the complex hierarchy of medieval warfare, appearances often mattered as much as results. A commander who failed to respond to an attack, regardless of the tactical wisdom of restraint, risked being seen as weak or cowardly. "What do you propose, my lord?" he asked. De Montfort pointed to a section of the map that showed the area around Blackwood Glen. "We cannot assault the glen itself. You've made it clear that would be suicide. But the Welsh must have supply lines, must have bases where they rest and refit between attacks. If we can identify these locations, we might be able to strike at them before they can disperse." It was a sound strategy, one that showed the captain's understanding of the principles of irregular warfare. The good knight had seen similar approaches used successfully in other conflicts, though he had also seen them fail when the enemy proved more elusive than expected. "The Welsh are skilled at concealment," he said carefully. "They know these lands better than we do, have had generations to prepare hiding places and escape routes. Finding their bases will not be easy." "Perhaps not," de Montfort agreed. "But we have advantages as well. We have informants among the local population, people who might be willing to provide information in exchange for protection or payment. And we have you, the only man to have seen the Welsh rebels in action and lived to tell of it." The weight of expectation in the captain's voice was unmistakable. The good knight was being asked to use his experience, his knowledge of the enemy's tactics and capabilities, to help plan a campaign of retaliation. It was a reasonable request, one that any surviving officer would be expected to fulfill. Yet it filled him with a deep sense of unease. He had fought the Welsh rebels, had seen their skill and determination firsthand. More importantly, he had seen the justice of their cause, had recognized in their desperate courage something that transcended the simple categories of loyalty and treason. They were men fighting for their homeland, for their right to live according to their own customs and traditions. In other circumstances, he might have admired such dedication. But circumstances were what they were, and he was bound by oaths that could not be set aside simply because he sympathized with his enemies. He was an English knight, sworn to serve his king and uphold royal authority wherever it might be challenged. Personal feelings had no place in such calculations. "I will provide whatever assistance I can, my lord," he said finally, "though I fear the Welsh will not make it easy for us." Over the following days, the garrison became a hive of activity as preparations for the retaliatory campaign began in earnest. Messengers rode out to neighboring strongholds, carrying requests for reinforcements and supplies. Scouts were dispatched to gather intelligence on Welsh movements and positions. The good knight found himself at the center of these preparations, his knowledge of the enemy's tactics making him an invaluable resource for the planning staff. Yet even as he contributed to the effort, he could not shake the feeling that they were preparing for another disaster. The Welsh had demonstrated their ability to strike at times and places of their choosing, to inflict maximum damage while minimizing their own losses. They would not be drawn into the kind of conventional battle that English forces were trained to fight, would not make the mistake of defending fixed positions that could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The reinforcements began to arrive within a week, knights and men-at-arms from garrisons throughout the region, their banners adding splashes of color to the gray stone walls of the fortress. With them came supplies and equipment, the material necessities of medieval warfare. The good knight watched their arrival with mixed feelings, knowing that many of these eager young men would not survive the campaign that was being planned. Among the new arrivals was Sir Robert de Clare, a knight whose reputation for both courage and cruelty had preceded him. He was a man in his 30s, tall and powerfully built, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from a lifetime of successful violence. His armor was of the finest quality, his weapons perfectly maintained, his bearing that of someone who had never known defeat. De Clare sought out the good knight on his first evening at the garrison, approaching him in the great hall with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "So you're the sole survivor of Blackwood Glen," he said without preamble, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded hall. "Tell me, how does it feel to be the only man to escape when 20 others died?" The question was clearly intended as a provocation, a challenge to the good knight's honor and courage. Around them, conversations died as other knights turned to watch the confrontation. The good knight felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded violence, the body's preparation for combat that had become as natural as breathing over the centuries. But he had learned long ago that not every challenge needed to be met with steel. Sometimes the wisest course was to deflect rather than confront, to avoid unnecessary conflict that would serve no useful purpose. "It feels like failure, Sir Robert," he replied quietly. 20 good men died under my command. Their deaths weigh heavily on my conscience. The simple honesty of the response seemed to take de Clare by surprise. He had clearly expected anger or defensiveness, something that would justify the confrontation he was seeking. Instead, he found himself facing a man who acknowledged his failures without making excuses for them. "Yes, well," he said, his voice losing some of its aggressive edge. "I'm sure you did your best under difficult circumstances. These Welsh rebels are cunning fighters from what I hear." "They are indeed," the good knight agreed. "Any man who underestimates them does so at his peril." The conversation might have ended there, but de Clare seemed determined to press his point. Still, it seemed strange that only one man should survive such a complete disaster. Some might wonder if there were circumstances that favored your escape over that of your comrades. The implication was clear and deeply insulting. De Clare was suggesting that the good knight had somehow abandoned his men, had saved himself at their expense. It was the kind of accusation that could not be ignored, that demanded satisfaction according to the code of chivalric honor. The good knight rose slowly from his seat, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. Around them, the hall fell completely silent as men sensed the approach of violence. Even the servants stopped their work, their eyes fixed on the two knights who faced each other across the narrow space between the tables. "Are you questioning my honor, Sir Robert?" the good knight asked, his voice deadly quiet. De Clare's hand moved to his own weapon, his body tensing for combat. "I question nothing. I merely observe that your survival, while fortunate, raises certain questions that might benefit from clarification." It was a carefully worded challenge, one that stopped just short of an outright accusation of cowardice, but left no doubt about the speaker's meaning. The good knight felt the familiar surge of anger that had driven him through countless battles, the cold fury that made him dangerous beyond measure. But before he could respond, Captain de Montfort's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Enough!" the captain barked, rising from his own seat at the high table. "We are here to plan a campaign against our enemies, not to fight among ourselves. Sir Robert, you will apologize for your implications, or you will find yourself confined to quarters until this expedition is concluded." De Clare's face flushed with anger, but he was not foolish enough to defy a direct order from the expedition's commander. "I meant no offense," he said stiffly. "If my words were misunderstood, I regret any confusion they may have caused." It was not really an apology, but it was enough to diffuse the immediate crisis. The good knight nodded curtly and resumed his seat, though his hand remained near his sword hilt. Around them, conversations gradually resumed as the tension in the hall began to dissipate. But the damage had been done. De Clare's words had given voice to suspicions that others had been thinking but not saying, had raised questions about the good knight's survival that would not be easily dismissed. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, could sense the doubt that now colored their perception of him. It was a familiar burden, one that he had carried in other times and other places. The nature of his existence made him an object of suspicion wherever he went. A man whose survival of seemingly impossible odds raised uncomfortable questions about the natural order of things. He had learned to live with such scrutiny, to accept it as the price of his continued existence. But that did not make it any easier to bear. The planning sessions continued over the following days, with maps spread across tables and strategies debated by men who had never seen the terrain they were discussing. The good knight contributed what he could, sharing his knowledge of Welsh tactics and the geography of Blackwood Glen. But he could sense the subtle change in how others treated him, the way conversations died when he approached, the careful distance that his fellow knights now maintained. De Clare's words had poisoned the well of trust that was essential to military cooperation. Even those who did not believe the implications of cowardice found themselves wondering about the circumstances of his survival, questioning whether there might be more to the story than he had revealed. The good knight bore it all in silence, knowing that any attempt to defend himself would only make the situation worse. He had learned long ago that some accusations could not be answered with words, that time and deeds were the only remedies for damaged reputation. But time was a luxury he might not have, and deeds could be double-edged weapons that cut both ways. As the expedition prepared to depart, he found himself wondering if this campaign would finally provide the answers he had been seeking for so long. Perhaps in the forests of Wales, among enemies who fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, he would find either redemption or the final rest that had eluded him for so many centuries. The silver thread that bound him to existence remained unbroken, but it felt more fragile now, stretched thin by the weight of accumulated guilt and the burden of impossible survival. Soon, very soon, it would be tested once again in the crucible of battle. And this time, he was not certain it would hold. The good knight will return. Subscribe for more.